So if you want to lazy load now, all we have to do is change your routing configuration to use load component. And again, if you're still using modules, you can use load children instead. So here, the first route is using load component, and the second route is using load children. Now, if I add the same amount of components from my previous example where you only saw 2, let's say if I had 10 and lazy load them using this kind of configuration, then this is what I end up with. All right, so you can see my main bundle size went down to 106 kilobytes, and I didn't even do much, right? All I had to do is change my routing configuration to use load component or load children, and that's it. And again, when I serve the application in the browser now, the only chunk you will see in the network requests are the ones from the initial chunk section that you see on the top. All the other lazy chunk files that you see in the second section of the screenshot will only be loaded when I route to those components, right? So, like I said, lazy loading is a great feature and already very well known. But there's another thing that you can do to increase the performance, and that is called preloading. Preloading is a feature that will load the components in the background without having the user to activate the route. Okay. So combining this with lazy loading your modules, it will give you I think, the ultimate in performance and user experience. So this is, I think, very useful if you know that the user will be visiting a specific section of the site anyways, right? So again, you'll get the best of the both worlds. You can, your initial bundle will be small, and the remainder of your bundles will be loaded in the background. So in a module-based application, all you have to do is use the preloading strategy property and set it to preload all modules. So this is the setup for that. And for standalone applications, you would just add with preloading to the provide router function of your app config. And like I said, you can also create your own preloading strategy by implementing the preloading strategy interface. So this interface provides just the preload function and needs to return an observable by either calling the load function when the module should be preloaded, or it can return an observable of null indicating no preloading. And again, this is a strategy I find that's useful if a user visits a certain area. Like, for example, say they log into the admin section. While they log in, you can probably preload all the other modules, right? So in this function, I'm using also the preload property of the route data, which needs to be defined in the router configuration. And you can see that in the second snippet here. So once you have that implemented, just provide it to your app config and you're good to go. And I have a demo, not a demo. I have this entire code snippet. You can get it from the repo, like I mentioned earlier. So here is a quick animation, from the demo application that shows first you'll see the main.js is loaded, and after a few milliseconds, you'll see that the lazy loaded chunks are popping up without any routes changing. So yeah, so this is the performance topic or improvement that you can do with routing. Any questions so far? No? Awesome. Cool. So let's go to the next section, which is deferred views. So this feature allows, again, components or part of the template to indicate that they should be lazy loaded, right? And this works by simply adding the defer block into your template. And it also comes with additional blocks such as placeholder, loading, errors, and triggers. So this is very useful for sections on a page that are not immediately visible or necessary when the user first lands on it. You could combine this with you could combine the deferred views with lazy loaded routes. So that way your route is lazy loaded and the content on that page is also lazy loaded. Okay, so you have two performance optimization happening there. And I'll show you an example of that later. Again, another animation. And you can also decide how you want to lazy load those components by using one of the many triggers that you can see on the right side here. So the syntax for using a defer is pretty straightforward and works really well with the Angular's existing control flow syntax. Here's an example how this could look. So if you don't use any triggers or conditions, like I'm doing here right now, then the defer block is triggered when the browser state becomes idle. So this is the default behavior, and it's essentially the same as writing this, right? Okay, so when you build your application now, Angular will automatically create a lazy loaded bundle for this specific component. Okay, so this is how it's going to look, right? So you see you have the main.js and the component, which is part of the defer block, is lazy loaded. And here is how this will look, right? So when the browser is idle, it will fetch the bundle and render the component. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a request happening here in the network tab, which pulls down which pulls actually down two chunk files, right? So one is for the lazy loaded component, and the other one is for the route. So like I mentioned earlier, deferred views come with additional blocks. The placeholder is the first one we'll discuss. So this block can be used to display content before the defer block triggers. So be aware though that the content used for the placeholder itself is not lazy loaded. Okay. So that means the content in the placeholder is shown first until the defer block content is ready to render. And the placeholder itself comes with an option argument called minimum that allows you to set the time to display the content. So here's how this would look. So here essentially I'm saying wait at least 500 milliseconds before displaying the images component. And until then, the content in the placeholder block will appear. So here's an example of how this would look. And like I mentioned earlier, right, you could lazy load the route and also lazy load the content, which is what's happening here. So there's two performance optimizations happening within the same page. So now if we take a look at the downloaded chunk, like I promised you earlier. So in the first one, we see the first chunk is the route itself, okay? And the second one is the lazy loaded component, right? And I think on its on its own is already a very cool feature. Like, you're using the maximum, I guess, optimization for routing and deferred views. Now, depending on what you do within the components, there's additional optimization you could do there as well. So next is the loading block, which is used to display some content, while the content defined in the defer block is still loading or has started to load. So this is different from the placeholder, which will appear before the loading starts, okay? So again, the placeholder is used to show content before the loading starts, and the loading block is used to show the content while the content is still loading. And this block also comes with two optional arguments. after, and minimum. And similar to the placeholder argument, the minimum argument is used to set the time to display the content. And the second argument after is used to define the waiting time before showing the loading content. So here we're telling the block to wait at least 1 second before displaying the loading content and show it for at least 500 milliseconds. So this is also usually done to avoid any flickering, right? Sometimes your content is loaded too quickly and you see a flicker. So this kind of strategy, I guess, is used when you want to avoid that. And yeah, at the end, you can also use both, right? You can use the loading and the placeholder together if you wanted to. Right? And then finally, there is the error block, which is to use to show anything when something in the deferred block fails. And again, the content within the error block is not lazy loaded; it's eagerly loaded. Cool. So now coming to our triggers, which I think can be quite useful if you want fine-grained control on when the content should appear. So these are triggered using when or on. And the condition needs to return always a Boolean value. So here's an example of how this could be used. So here we say load the images when some condition is truthy, right? Keep in mind though that when this condition becomes falsy, then the placeholder I'm using here will not reappear. So it's a one-way interaction. And similarly to that, you can also use the on trigger. So in this second example, we're using 2 on conditions. And these conditions are always evaluated as or, okay? And you can also mix when and on conditions, and they are also always evaluated as or. So in this example, we're using the interaction trigger, and this trigger will load the deferred content when the user interacts with the element through a click or keyboard event or after 5 seconds. So by default, the placeholder acts as the interaction element. So I think this is like really cool. Like you could show content, when the user clicks on it or when there's some kind of behavior, like a user behavior that you want to wait on before showing something. So here's how this could look. So I added this in this section, and there's a placeholder here. And as soon as I click on the element, the component gets loaded. And you can see that by the network chunk in the in the network tab here, right? So that's the second optimization on deferred views. Any questions on that? I hope I'm not going too fast here.
I do have a quick question.
Yes.
So let's say that we have images loading coming from REST API, and while images are getting to be represented, are we able to have like preloaded image here in the content? So let's say we have a preload image that's on the article, and once the images are loaded, then it replaces that preloaded content.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question fully. So you're saying you have a REST service that loads images, and you have a placeholder saying loading images. So when
Correct.
the images are loaded, then the placeholder will disappear and the images will appear. Is that
Correct.
the
Yes.
question?
Yes.
Yeah, that is actually what will happen. Yeah.
I understand. Okay, this is going to help with a lot of ACO in like the potential problems that we have currently in Angular. especially like LCP or the largest control paint element, where you actually are unable to control this, but it's such a great tool and such a great thing that we are able to control it right now.
Yeah, it's a great question, and that is also leading me to my next performance tip, which is the NgOptimizedImage. Listen to this and see if this makes more sense for you to use that instead, because I believe this would apply more to your scenario. So yeah, just listen to it and let me know if you have any questions after that. Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So yeah, the image NgOptimizedImage directive. Yeah, that's probably one of the most underused directives to optimize, performance and images. And it comes loaded with many of out-of-the-box features like lazy loading, image optimization, placeholders, and responsive images. So unlike the standard image element, the directive can automatically optimize image resizing to the source set attribute. So this is very important so that the most optimized image or version of an image can be downloaded for the user's device and network conditions. And this is done through the source set. Just imagine having to set the source set manually to support all the image sizes is quite painful, right? So here's the source set list, if you're wondering, and just if you had to write this list manually for your image element, it would look something like this. And this isn't even the complete list yet. So it really depends on the sizes you're supporting. And having the directive take care of this all for your images, I think it's a big time saver, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is the lazy attribute. So this attribute can use the technique again to defer the loading of off-screen images until they're needed, right? So this might be useful to the question that we just had. And it's the same technique as we saw earlier with the defer block. So this reduces the initial load time and also improves, the performance of your application. So all you have to do is add the loading attribute and set it to lazy. Okay. Now, while this sounds cool, you need to be really careful with that because you should only use this for images that are not in the viewport. Okay. So that means images like your company logo or any other image that should be visible as soon as the page is loaded. And in those scenarios, you do not want to use this. Okay? You want to eager load the images. So by default, lazy is set to all images that are not marked as priority. So you have to be really careful with this. So when the image is marked with priority, the fetch priority is also automatically set to high and loading is set to eager. So these options are super useful and they give instructions to the browser to download the image as soon as possible. And setting the fetch priority can also improve the LCP, which is the largest contentful paint. So LCP can also be understood as the loading metric used to identify how long the page takes to load. And this is done by looking at, when the largest bit of content is loaded. So in many cases, this is like an image element or an H1 tag or something similar like that. And usually images take longer to display. So the browser needs to find the image, download it, and display it. And to help the browser, we can set the priority. So to understand actually how this works, I want to first talk about how this would look without setting the priority. So consider the following image element, right, without using the directive or setting any priority. So by default, the priority of this image is set to low, okay? You can see that in the priority column of your network tab in the bottom right here, okay? So it's marked with number 2. So first you see low, and above that you see high. Now, once the browser sees that this image is in your viewport, or also known as an on-screen image, it automatically changes the priority to high. Okay, so the browser has to detect that, okay, here's an image, I see it, it's right, it's on the screen, the user doesn't have to scroll. So it's actually not a low priority image, it's a high priority image, right? And the way to see the breakdown in the priority column is by changing, or by enabling the big request rows that you see here under number 1. Okay, so you need to enable this, otherwise you will not see the initial and final priority. You will only see the final one. Okay, so this is again very useful, as we understand the browser is doing additional work to change the priority of the image. And this is where the priority attribute comes into the picture, right? So now if you use the directive and set the priority on it, then you can see that the initial and final priority is set to high. Right, so this is helping the browser to do less work, as the priority is already set, and the browser can essentially just download the image and render it as soon as possible. It doesn't have to go through the whole check of if it's a low priority, high priority, and things like that. So another cool thing is that if you're using the directive with an image provider and you're not setting the priority, and Angular detects that your image is in the viewport, then the directive will throw an error. Okay, it's asking you to mark the image with priority. You will see an error like this in your console. So this really helps the developer to make sure that they're using the most optimized features of the NgOptimizedImage directive. So another awesome feature I like is the placeholder, which helps to show a placeholder while the image is loading or being fetched. So this on its own, I think, provides also a really good user experience. And if you're using a CDN like Cloudinary that supports image resizing, you should automatically receive a low resolution image for the placeholder. You don't need to do anything, any code changes or anything like that for this to work. It works out of the box. Okay. Yeah, but if you want to use a completely different image, right, then you can also set the placeholder to an encoded version of an image in base 64 format. So here I'm using a simple base 64 for the placeholder. So on the left, you will see that the image is quite blurry, and that is the default, and it's on purpose, right? So it kind of gives the user an impression that the final image is still being loaded. And you can, however, disable this effect altogether if you do not want to use it by using the placeholder config object and setting the blur property to false. You can see that in the right side. You can also see that the image on the left is downloaded in the request tab, right? So one thing you want to keep in mind is that the base 64 image should be kept small. And again, you will otherwise get an error like this. So it's very detailed. When your base 64 is larger than 4 kilobyte, then you will get an error. So Angular recommends to keep your base 64 smaller than 4 kilobyte or 4,000 characters. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about responsive images. So like I said, even responsive images are supported out of the box. And that happens by setting the source set attribute with the necessary information, giving the browser, again, instructions to download the best possible image based on the user's device. And this can work by setting the size attribute or without it. So you don't need to worry about that. And so the directive will automatically generate the density dependent source set. And that means that 1x, the 1x image will be automatically downloaded by the browser on low pixel density screens and 2x for high density screens. And it does that automatically. Okay. So a higher density or a device pixel ratio on screens generally means that you have a higher pixel count and a better image. So here we can see that the source set is automatically generated, one for 400 and one for 800. And in Chrome Developer Tools, you can actually test the density, right? There's an option where you can set the density and you can test it out. So just for comparison, most newer iPhones have a DPR set to 3, and Android, for some reason, is always way ahead of iPhone. Their DPR is set to either 3 or higher already. Okay. So you will get a really high quality image on Android, while on iPhone, you may get one that is up to 3. So again, if we look at our previous example, so here we can see on the left screenshot that the image downloaded is 400 by 400, right? And again, that is done automatically. There was no code change and nothing was needed. So here, again, in the left screen, I've set the density to 1 and it downloaded the 400 by 400 image. And on the right, I set the density to 2 and it automatically downloaded the higher quality image, right? So this is pretty cool, I think, when you have mobile devices, right, where you want to make sure that the user gets the best image possible. So adding sizes, has a similar effect. So here I'm setting the image to be 80% of the viewport. And what that means is that it will automatically generate the source set for all available breakpoints. And here's the list if you're wondering. And that's the generated list, right? So I think this is already really helpful without having you to provide different sizes for each breakpoint, right? And if you only support a subset of breakpoints, then you can customize the list by providing the image config DI token to your provider. So you don't need to necessarily use all of these. So here's an example. So here I'm setting the breakpoints to just 3 values, and you can see that the generated source set is automatically only for those 3 sizes, right? And you can also define your own source sets if you wanted to, using the ng source set attribute directly on the element itself. So the other cool thing is you can also use media queries to control the image size. So a very common approach I have seen is to render like multiple columns on the desktop, and only rendering like a single column on mobile. So here in this example, the directive will use 100 view width as a factor to download the image on viewport with maximum 768 pixel. And otherwise it will use 50 view width. So that means that when you have 2 columns, then the images will be smaller because you have a smaller viewport. And when it's a single column, you'll actually get a larger image, right? So in this right screenshot here, right, you can see that when I resize the window to make it a single column, it downloads an additional image. And that's a much smaller image. And that is then used inside the image element. Okay, so yeah, that's a wrap for the image section. I hope this made sense. Any questions for that?
I
Yes.
wanted to ask if we can use the NgOptimized image for SVG elements or video elements as well.
For which elements?
Video elements and SVG and icons.
Video element. Yeah, SVG should be fine, I believe. Videos, honestly, I have not tried it yet. So that would be interesting to know. I'll make a note of that and see if that is supported or not. But I'm not sure if that works with videos.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So that brings us to our next topic, which is change detection and zoneless. So I think we all know change detection is one of the core mechanisms in Angular that tracks changes of your application and updates UI accordingly. And that works by using Zone.js. And by default, Angular uses a strategy that checks the entire component tree for changes, which again ensures everything stays in sync, but can also be performance intensive, especially when you have large applications. And to optimize this process, Angular offered the on-push change detection strategy. And that strategy only checks a component and its children when one of its input properties changes, right? So that means that instead of refreshing the entire component tree, we'll just re-render the components directly affected by the change with all of its ancestors up to the root. So just focusing on checking one branch of the nodes instead of the entire component tree, right? So to implement on-push change detection, all you need to do is modify your component and set the change detection property to on-push. All right, so now I want to talk just a little bit about zoneless in Angular, which is a more advanced approach on improving performance. So in the release of Angular 18, the team rolled out a zoneless feature that has taken change detect that changes the change detection optimization even further. So we know that Angular relies on Zone.js, which makes development easier, but it's quite an overhead. So by going zoneless, we can manually control when change detection runs. And that allows us to optimize performance even further. So in Angular, the concept behind zoneless change detection is built on the idea that components will let Angular know when something is changed. And Angular offers specific APIs to facilitate this change detection. That's like mark for check, mark view dirty, like signal changes, event handlers, and setting inputs. So there's a few more like attaching or detaching a view using view container ref. So using this API, Angular reduces the overhead, right? Again, with the change detection. And building application without Zone.js is fairly simple. I believe a few have already started to experiment with that. I believe Minko recently published a screenshot where Google Fonts or something like that, also using Angular, but it's not using Zone.js anymore. So I think that is already pretty cool. Now keep in mind though that this whole zoneless feature is currently experimental. So if you want to use it or try it out, just keep these things in mind. And all you have to do is essentially just add the provide experimental and zoneless change detection during the application bootstrap. Remove Zone.js from your poly file if you still have any, and make sure that you're at least using Angular version 18, right? And again, keep in mind that this is experimental and anything can change at any time. And I would strongly encourage you, if you run into any issues, please open a ticket in the GitHub Angular repo so that the Angular team is aware of this. I think we all want to get away from Zone.js. Yeah, and that's it. I hope you found these tips useful. And like I previously mentioned, you can get in touch with me over Twitter, link or LinkedIn. And at the bottom here, you can see the GitHub repo with all the examples of the little animations that I had shown. Thank you so much.
Discovery talk. I love discovering new features, new technologies. It makes me procrastinate a lot, but it's really awesome. And for tonight, it's about Nitro, but but not only about Nitro, and I will tell you what's Nitro, but Nitro powered full stack Angular application, because we are talking, we are into Angular Macedonia. So let me check. Okay, so Angular application. Why are we building Angular application? As Mark from the Angular team says, about building great web apps. Sorry, but which type of web apps can we build? We can use firstly CSR, client-side rendering, for application. It's about building application to produce static assets when you're running ngBuild, and you host these assets on a server, and when required, they are queried by user, and it's about the browser responsibility to execute JavaScript to run the application and to render all your content, either it's about static HTML or dynamic one. That's the first option. The second one is quite related to the first one. It's static state generation. It's quite related because it's also about generating static assets. So you run ngBuild, it builds your application, and there is a difference. The difference is about the static state generation. It's about, at build time, you build your application the same way that you're doing with CSR, but you're also pre-rendering some pages or all your pages. So it's about creating static HTML file. It's not HTML file like we are used to with components. It's really HTML files that you can load in your browser. You drag the build file in your browser, and they will run. They don't depend on JavaScript. It's about static. So that's the second solution. And there is the third one that I would get interest into for this talk. It's about CSR. So server-side rendering. So it's not the same as CSR and SSG, because in this situation, we don't build static assets. We build an application that we host on server, but we need a server to be able to run actively our application thanks to a server engine. So it's really different. And why doing so? Using such a server might be costly compared to hosting static assets and for CSR or SSG. The motivation it's about the same as SSG. It's about processing, pre-rendering HTML content. And for SSG, it's at build time, and for CSR, it's at runtime. At runtime, because you might need some dynamic content. So if it's about pre-rendering a code of conduct, you might not update it every day, so SSG is enough. But if you're having an application like Amazon, when you want to pre-render a product page, it might change every second. So you can just rebuild your application, and that's where SSR come in game for you. And why doing so? Why pre-rendering? Why you could just do CSR, so client-side learning. It's about SEO, so search engine optimization, when your user are trying to find about your business. You want to be in the top result on Google or whatever search engine, and by pre-rendering your content, it really helps a lot for this search engine to index your application. And so for Angular, it needs a 7 engine to run your application, and currently Angular is using Express. Express is quite well known in the community. It's an old web framework for web servers. It defines itself as a fast, unopinionated, minimalist web framework for Node.js. So yeah, it's minimalist. Can be just about a few files or even a single file. It's unopinionated, unlike Angular. You can compose, arcade. There is a huge library ecosystem, but fast. It was fast until concurrency came in. And concurrency led to innovation and led to performance, and Express is really not the fastest solution out there. There are better solutions like Testify, Attendees, and Nitro. So Nitro, and why focus on Nitro? Nitro has been introduced in the Angular community thanks to Brandon Roberts, who created Analog.js. Analog.js is a meta framework for Angular. So meta framework is a framework built on top of the frameworks. And so it uses Angular, and it also uses Nitro. It uses both to be able to have an application using CSR, SSG, OSSR, and being a full stack solution. So with just analog, you can build your front end and your back end. Okay, but that's not a talk about analog. So what's the global motivation? And earlier this year, the Angular team decided to evaluate Nitro support. So that's from angular.dev, and they are considering supporting Nitro as a solution to replace Express for different reasons. So we are talking about portability, minimal design, and file-based routing. We will talk about that later on. And there were great progress from this point, and that's part of what's in the experimental stage. There are some experimental features about change detection, as Sonu explained, but for the next version, for version 19, which will be released on November 19, there are a lot of experimental features about SSR helping to do so. So, in fact, if you have to remind something from this talk, that's because I created it before the Angular team made some awesome features. If you want to consider moving away, if you have a SSR application, if you consider moving away from Express, it's not just about Nitro, it's about using other solutions. And so, Nitro, it defines itself. Nitro defines itself as a next generation server toolkit. It was wrongly promoted for a long time as a web server framework, because I feel like you can do about the same with API routes, with connecting a database, with having static assets. But the mindset is quite different, and it's about still creating web server, but with some other philosophy. And I was talking about Nitro as evaluating support for Angular, and as always, not just about Nitro. And here is an example from Matthew, which is an Angular collaborator and doing a lot of experimental repositories, and that's from one of its repositories called SSR v19, where he's trying and succeed to run Angular application, Angular SSR application with other server engine. And it tried with Ono, with and I don't remember for all of this, but here is H3. So most of the API here is from H3, which is a HTTP library, and we have just the Angular app engine, which is quite new to run the application. So it's not about just integrating Nitro or other server engine into Angular, but making it pluggable, and that's really exciting. And so it's about H3. So why talking about H3? Because in fact, H3 is part of Nitro. H3 is the HTTP layer of Nitro. And once again, it means that you might just use H3 as a server engine for your Angular SSR application. It's really a lot of solutions that are available now, thanks to latest changes, which are still experimental for the next version. And so Nitro is built upon H3, but they're both part of the same GitHub organization, which is called IonJS for unrevealed JavaScript, if I remember. So it's about a lot of small JavaScript library, mostly tools, utilities, and that's how Nitro is built. It's more about a collection of libraries that are real frameworks. Frameworks like Angular, it's built upon a collection of libraries, but that's still a framework. You're in a frame. You have to follow how Angular asks you to do some task, to use some APIs. For Nitro, it's more about use whatever you want, and it's really composable. It's really hackable. There's minimal design, so it explains why Analog.js chose Nitro, because it was not just about saying, okay, I have my front end with Angular, I have my back end with Nitro, and we just deliver them as a single package. No, it's about being able to connect Angular with Nitro quite easily. And that's the idea of Nitro. It's about being framework agnostic. Yeah, it's framework agnostic, but it wasn't at the beginning because so I don't know if you know about Next. Next is another meta framework inside the JavaScript ecosystem, and it's using the green color because it's a meta framework for Vue.js, in fact. And Next is using Nitro, and Next is not just using Nitro. In fact, Nitro was created for Next. So it wasn't agnostic framework at the beginning, but the Next team is really about open source, and not just about the Vue.js ecosystem. We know with Vite, for example, that we have a lot of efforts in the Vue.js community not to be only about Vue. And so they decided to open source Nitro. So now it's a lone open source solution. It still powers Next as its own server engine, but there are two separate projects. So we have Next. So if we take a look at the JavaScript ecosystem, how Nitro is used. So we know these three frameworks, Vue.js, Angular, and React. So Vue.js is using Nitro for Next as a meta framework. If you don't know about Vue and Next is really well known. So we have Nitro being used in the Vue.js ecosystem. For Angular, it can be now possible. So might be Nitro, it might be H3, it might be another 7th-gen as explained, but you can use it quite easily. And for React, React itself, it's just a library. If we go on the Meta framework side, there is Next.js, which is the most well-known one, but it doesn't use Nitro. But there is a new project upcoming, and this project is called 10stack Start. 10stack is a collection of libraries in the React ecosystem. There is one that we started using in Angular. It's called 10stack Query, which help with state and API cache data. And it uses Nitro under the hood. It's not directly Nitro. It's about using Vinci, which is built upon Nitro. So there is Nitro you can find quite easily Nitro in the ecosystem and the JavaScript ecosystem today. And so we are also analog, as I told you. And if you heard about Solid, there is Solid Start, which is using a fork of Nitro. They decided to make their own fork of the project, but it means that it's really used. It might feel new for the community, but that's about the same for all projects. You might not heard about them for the first years, or for people just liking to make experiments. But yeah, nowadays you can't find it in a lot of projects. And so what are the features? I won't dive in all features because they are most of quite well known, and there is no quite difference besides the way to write them. So we have server routes, so you can make your API with it, but it can be about exposing static assets also, or whatever you want. We have Minko GetChef. We used Vinci to make an example for Angular SSR, and it was able to expose two routes, one for SSR application and one for CSR application. So you can really compose and do whatever you want. It's really easy. It's not a frame with some limitations. And there was other solutions or other features like WebSocket, plugins, a cache and storage layers, and can even define some tasks to be run. So, okay, but let's focus on some interesting topic about the developer experience. So here is an example of an API route. So it's quite small. It uses define event handler or event handler as a function which is exposed. And inside we retrieve some params in the root with get rid of params, and that's the whole code of a file. I didn't miss import. There is no import because Nitro is using auto import, so it declares some APIs as globals, and doing so you don't have to import manually all the API. And this API, in fact, the get rid of param is itself from H3. So that's really it is a set of library ecosystem that don't remind that much this syntax, because they're working on a new beta version for H3 and for Nitro. Part of it's about being closer to web standard rather than being tied to Node currently. And for most hosting provider solution, you can find a Node of environment, but for some of them, it's different. So they're working to remove Node API for the project. In fact, Angular is doing about the same. It's not done yet, but they will work about removing all Node.js API from Angular SSR to be able to be deployed for everywhere. And so we have this quite simple example, but there is something quite new if you're used to API web server solution. It's the file-based routing. It was named in the Nitro introduction in a previous slide. File-based routing is about using a file system to define routes, to define the path to your APIs. So by taking the same example, if we define this file in a folder, in a server root profile folder, and by naming the file with name .get.ts, it means that we will have a route, an API route called profile, and with a dynamic param being named. So that's the way to name routes. So it might feel weird at the beginning. You might feel like someone was tired to write regex and to go on us with some magic, but when you're used to it, it's quite simple. And in fact, I find it way easier to understand how your routes work. It's quite about the same on Angular side. It might be difficult to understand how your routes work. What's your route structures, and by doing so, I find it quite easy to understand how it works, and you can more easily isolate the logic. On backend side, we are used to controllers, to services for a given domain, and here it's just about the controller, which more about the root itself. It's your file system path, and your file is directly about the service. So you isolate which path in a given file. So I find it way more easier to find your logic rather than having big files with services files in the backend are already big when you get started with medium to big applications. Another great feature about the developer experience is about the deployment. I mean, for most solutions that we have out there, might be front-end, back-end, you have a great documentation about how to use these solutions, these frameworks, these libraries, but you're quickly stuck when you're getting started with deployment. And we have common solution to deploy application like Netlify, the Cells, Tomcat, and whatever. And the thing is, there is always some configuration that you need to do to deploy, depending on your framework, depending on the hosting provider, and where is the responsibility? Which it's about framework, it's about the hosting provider to explain how to do it. And Nitro decided to include it by default. So there is a zero configuration feature that means that you just need to define a preset. So it might be a preset Netlify, a cell, or this one, there is a zero configuration preset. And by just defining it in your Nitro configuration, at the time that you build your application, it will create the expected folder and files for the given preset. So, for example, Netlify, there is one. There is Netlify and Netlify Age, and depending on the one that you use, it will create just the folders that were expected at the beginning from Netlify. So you don't have to care about that. You just want to write code and to deploy your application, and it's quite easy. But at the end, and at the conclusion, do you need and do I need Nitro in my Angular CSR application? Firstly, it's about SSR, and most projects don't need SSR. CSR is quite enough. CSR and CC come into the game when you really need SEO and you really have to go away from CSR if it's about SEO and being really visible in a search engine. But when it's about CSR, I'd say that going away from Express is a good idea, and you can challenge the solution. If it's just about having a search engine to run your application, rather than Nitro, just use H3. It's one of the most performant solutions, and by being into Nitro, if you use Nitro and just for the H3 layer, it will be slower. So you just use H3. But if you need more tools, Nitro might be useful. It doesn't mean that you have to create a full stack application with it. You might already have your API. You might not want people to learn about a new solution to create web servers, and you might want all your web servers to use the same technology. But it might still be useful because even as a front-end engineer, you might have some interest to be to work on some API routes. It might be about generating Open Graph dynamic image, the image that you can see on social media by sharing a link. So it might be static, but you might make a dynamic one, and it's still about HTML on server side. So you might help the backend team to do so. And by isolating it on your SSR application, even if you have your web server with your wall API on another project, it might help to have everything for the front end together. It might be about white labeling if you're building an application, and depending on your client, there is a different background color. For example, you might want to use an API route just to delete just at runtime to be able to serve different style files. So it might be just about some utilities, and that Nitro can be useful. So that's all for this small introduction, which I hope will help you to understand what are the changes that might happen and what the place of Nitro in such application. And I'm Jerome. Among other things, I'm inside the Angular community. I'm admin on the Discord. I lead the French community. I maintain way too many open source projects, and I just created two projects. One called Angular Feature Roadmap. So if you want to know about latest features and there's stage, if you're experimental, preview, or stable. So there, I have a project for it, and I have Angular Hub where you can find Angular Macedonia with all other events and community for the Angular community.